Hey everyone, I'm Norm. Welcome to Breaking Back, a tennis podcast by fans, for fans, covering all aspects of the game with an unfiltered lens. And I'm here with my co-hosts, Peter and Chris. Welcome to Breaking Back.
Welcome to Breaking Back, presented by Portland, Maine's Lone Pine Brewing Company and their new Winter Carnival beer, which was just released in mid-November. Winter Carnival is a 5.2% ABV seasonal winter ale brewed with the colder months in mind. Winter Carnival has a custom spice blend with notes of clove, coriander, ginger, and orange peel. Thank you, Lone Pine.
Wow, that's so herbal.
It is. And they just merged with Lord Hobo, by the way, Chris, down in Mass. So now
that's a big deal.
Lord Hobo and their boom sauce is going to have 10x distribution up here in Maine and vice versa for Lone Pine in Mass.
Well, thank you, listeners, for joining us for our 8th episode here in 2024. We are very pleased to have with us from the world of tennis a distinguished tennis journalist, Stephanie Myles. Stephanie Myles is a Canadian tennis journalist with extensive experience covering the sport. She's the publisher and editor-in-chief of opencourt.ca, a specialized tennis website that offers in-depth analysis and coverage of tennis events worldwide, with a particular focus on Canadian players. Before founding Open Court, Myles served as a sports journalist at the Montreal Gazette, where she covered various sports, including the Montreal Expos, still the best logo of all time. During their final years in the city, her expertise and insightful reporting have led to contributions to several prominent media outlets, including CBS Sports, where she has provided analysis on Canadian tennis players and major tournaments. Myles is also a member of the International Tennis Writers Association, reflecting her standing in the global tennis journalism community. In addition to her written work, she maintains an active presence on YouTube and Twitter, where she shares exclusive tennis videos and interviews, further showcasing her total coverage of the sport. Welcome, Stephanie.
Well, thank you. You forgot all the TV and radio stuff, too. I'm basically the multimedia queen at this point.
Yeah. Well, fill us in a little bit more about your multimedia presence.
Well, yeah, very, very late in life, I've turned into a TV person. So I do analysis on TV, and also sometimes I'm on site and jump in remotely. I do that in French for a network that has the WTA rights, Davis Cup, BJK Cup, and of course the Canadian events. So I do that. I do a lot of radio. So yeah, it just basically kind of spread it out. Look, I'm a freelancer. So you just do as many things as possible to make yourself as useful as possible to people to make a living.
I got to say, I thought I was a junkie when it came to social media and watching and commenting. And every corner I step into, Stephanie, you have beat me to it. It's amazing to see your coverage, and you're everywhere.
Well, that would be my first question. I mean, tennis is a 12-month-a-year circuit with multiple organizations within it. Maybe we should start there with just how do you feel about how it's structured, and do you feel like it could be structured better?
The ideal way that we could sort of get tennis to kind of a way where everybody's going in the same direction. The theory is have a commissioner of tennis and have oversight over all of the governing bodies. That's never going to happen, ever. Everybody is just sort of fighting for their piece of the pie, and again, not necessarily rowing in the same direction. So that's one of the reasons why it's a complicated sport to understand, to manage, to make progress with, and most of all, of course, to cover. So it's a bit of a dog's breakfast in a lot of ways. And at the same time, what do you do? I mean, even within, let's say, the ATP Tour, for example, you try to have, let's say, a players' union, which is something that people have talked about lately. Well, what do? You basically have everybody from the CEOs making $20 million a year to the custodial staff making $10 an hour, all under the same umbrella, and you're going to try to serve them all. Basically, it's almost impossible to do. So that's one of the biggest challenges, certainly, that the sport has to deal with. And it's been that way forever, and I don't necessarily see it changing anytime soon.
So let's say, hypothetically, you were to pick, hypothetically again, Billie Jean King. You make her the commissioner of tennis worldwide, and you essentially make her in charge of a newly formed organization that's the FIFA of tennis globally. What would you have Billie Jean King do on day one?
Okay, that's a hypothetical. I think Billy would just come in and rip everything up and do crazy stuff and try to turn it into World Team Tennis circa 1974.
Forget about Billie Jean. Maybe it's just if tennis were to have a commissioner.
Yeah, okay, let's say it's John McEnroe.
All right, I'll go with that. Sure.
I think I wouldn't even know where to start, because the first thing that you have to do, I think, is get the men and the women together all the time. But there's so much downside to that because the men, and this is not even a whether women's tennis is better than men's tennis argument, because they're apples and oranges in my view. But the men's tour is exponentially larger business by about 4 or 5 times compared to the WTA. So they're talking now about merging certain things on the business side. But from what I was hearing even this week, basically they're starting to talk about, well, okay, how much is our share in terms of the ATP? Is it 80%? Is it 60%? There's no parity there. So you're trying to put all these various and disparate things under the same umbrella. And then you have the ITF, which has like $15,000 and $25,000 tournaments where basically you get $1,000 for winning the tournament, which doesn't even cover your expenses for the week. And then you have Davis Cup, which is a separate thing. Then you have the Grand Slams, which are 4 completely separate entities that all seem to want to be competing with each other for, I don't know, who has the biggest prize money any given year, or, oh, they had 100 million. We have to have 101 million this year. They had 800,000. Well, we have to beat that this year. Where they're all sort of competing against each other. I didn't realize that that was a contest. They don't compete with each other because they're at different times of year in different parts of the world on different surfaces. That's not necessary. But again, it all becomes part of the territoriality where everybody wants to make sure they keep their little chunk of the sport to themselves. So it's a great hypothetical argument, but I don't even think even as a hypothetical, it's even possible.
I think you bring up a great point that you do have to try to get the men and women together. I think those events are just better for a lot of reasons. And I guess I would point at the United States and what at least we're seeing here with the advent of professional women's lacrosse. Of course, the huge success of the WNBA last year. Now, granted, WNBA, we know, has been fully supported and underwritten by the NBA at a loss for a long time, but they've laid the foundation for last season to happen, and now they can build on it. Then there's the Women's Soccer League that just had their championship, and the team's owned by the same family that owns the Vikings in football and another team as well. So it's a roundabout way of asking, do you think it's time for where women's sports and now for tennis to kind of be on par and get that kind of equal attention?
Well, here's the thing. Women's tennis predates soccer and hockey, ice hockey, and basketball. It predates them by decades. And it was always the biggest women's sport there is. And yet it doesn't necessarily seem to be progressing. Obviously, it didn't have when you're starting from nothing, your progress is going to be tremendous. And certainly I'm going to wait 10 years to see if there's some staying power for some of the recent huge levels of interest in a lot of these women's sports. And I love that, by the way. But the problem that the women have, in my view, and again, I love women's tennis. I play women's tennis. I don't compare it to the men. I consider it to be just great on its own. But what happens when the women and the men are together is the women suffer by comparison.
Yeah.
Because it's so head to head. I mean, there's a reason why the men and the women on the PGA and the LPGA don't very, very rarely, except for a few exhibitions, compete the same week in the same place. And that was brought to the fore last week in Malaga because the men had their Davis Cup finals and the women had the Billie Jean King Cup finals at the same place, which wasn't originally supposed to happen, but ended up happening. So the men are in this 9,500 seat arena, while the women are in this pop-up temporary arena on the same site, which had less than half the capacity. And again, was literally a pop-up arena. So what was happening in there is you couldn't bring food in. I'm not even sure that necessarily there were any bathrooms or whatever. So they looked like the poor relation, the second best event the same week at the same place. And I don't think that those head-to-head comparisons do the women any good, because a lot of times when we're talking about the joint 1000 type events, a lot of times the women's matches can often be more compelling. They're just different. But again, when they join hands and spend time together for the week, the women always seem to come out second best for whatever reason. So I don't know what the solution is, because there are not very many women-only events that are necessarily hugely successful. I mean, Canada is one of them. Charleston is probably another, but there aren't that many. So it's definitely above my pay grade to try to figure out why. But part of it is that the WTA did not survive the pandemic well and basically practically went bankrupt. And they don't seem to have the ability to sell the greatest women's sport on the planet. And again, when you look at what's happened in soccer and hockey and basketball over the last couple of years, why is that? That's the question.
We actually talked to the former GM of the Delray Beach Open, and he made the comment, just as you were saying, like the best sport in the world to showcase these beautiful, physically gifted, you get access to them because they're on the court by themselves. You really get to know their personality. The sport really lends itself to commercial production, but it doesn't seem, or has yet to really translate to success.
Yeah, and it's getting left behind now, because now there are more options. And one thing that somebody pointed out to me recently, and I hadn't really thought of it that way because I'm not at tournaments as a fan, but there are so few sports where the access for the fans to the players, you can literally get right next to them or just walk up to them as they're walking through the grounds and grab a selfie or this or that. There's inherent dangers to that. All it's going to take is one bad situation. But the point is that it's very, very true. You can watch a player practice and then they can come off the court and you can get a selfie, you can get an autograph. That is proximity that you don't see in a lot of other sports. I mean, it's a tremendous thing.
I think John Butler, the executive director of the Delray Beach Open, said the exact same thing. We asked him, what are some of the best enhancements over the years while you were there for what seems like 30 years? And the first thing he said very quickly was, we installed courtside seats, which the proximity was almost too close to the players because they had to sign a disclaimer. If you get hit by a tennis ball or a racket, or you hear something you shouldn't hear.
Yeah, suck it up. Yeah.
Quick question, Stephanie, for you to sort of back up a little bit. How did you initially get into the sport of tennis? What drew you to the sport initially? Did you have any mentors? Were you a player, I assume?
Yeah, I've been involved in basically every possible area of tennis my whole life since I was probably 6 years old. And I mean, I've organized tournaments and I've coached and I've run tournaments and I've been on boards and even way back, too long ago to even remember, I went to my first U.S. Open almost to cover it when I was still in university, like 30 years ago. So, I covered baseball for about 10 years. And then when the Expos left Montreal, I could have left also. But as you guys mentioned, Montreal's a great city and, my family's here and, my husband is, everybody's here. So then it was a question of, what am I going to do? And so I did various other things and I did hockey. And then I said, look, why don't I do some tennis, and why don't I start, because I was working for a newspaper at the time, so why don't I start a tennis blog? And we're talking about 2007 or so. They really didn't understand what a tennis blog was, but they're like, yeah, do it. And so the idea was, because it's a whole chain of newspapers across Canada, that I was going to start covering the bigger events and everybody was going to sort of pitch in and then they were just going to run my stuff across the chain. And so I actually started there, the Open Court blog. And I think there were probably about 35 blogs on the newspaper's website at the time. And mine alone got about a third of the traffic. So
Wow.
The newspaper people, being what they are, they really didn't understand this at all. They were like, well, how come that's happening? And I said, well, here's how it works. When stuff's on the internet, you don't actually have to be living in Montreal to actually read it. So it was basically kind of like explaining it to 5-year-olds at the time, and which explains a lot about the newspaper industry. And so I said, when I write about a Slovenian player, let's say, all of a sudden I have a whole bunch of people from Slovenia who find it and follow me, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so it sort of started like that. And then the business being how it was, I certainly wanted to get out before I got out. And it was a good time to do it. And so I left the newspaper and I immediately had a lot of writing assignments. And then I sort of moved the website over. And so like that's kind of the base of operations. I fill it when I have more time. And it depends on how many assignments I have wherever I go. And I sort of prioritize. And sometimes I just pack it full of stuff. And sometimes I have 2 or 3 other things that I just have to do and I don't have as much time, but it's always sort of there.
We can't not talk about the biggest story in tennis right now, which is Murray being hired by Djokovic. And we've been chirping about it amongst ourselves. I'd love to hear your thoughts because you're a lot closer to these guys and know behind the scenes.
You didn't read her article about it on Open Court?
Well, it's for our listeners, though.
So much for that research prep.
I prepped. I absolutely prepped.
That was a rhetorical question, Stephanie.
Yeah, got it. It's kind of a big bombshell, isn't it? It's one of those things where just when you think you've probably seen it all, then something comes along and you just sort of go, whoa, hold up, hold up, hold up. And so I think there's a couple of elements in play there, right? The first, on the Andy Murray side, I don't think he's ready to be full-time drop the kids off at school guy. The guy just, he's obsessed with tennis. And certainly the last few years of his career, he proved that because he just wants to compete so badly. I mean, he's literally obsessed with it. And I think you have to be to get up to that level, but he takes it to a whole other level. And so I don't know if he wants to be a coach. Certainly the best players don't necessarily make the best coaches because of their disparate skill sets, but certainly it's an intriguing experiment. And on the Djokovic side, my take on it is when you look at basically, he kind of set fire to everything this year. He fired everybody. He fired Ivanisevic as a coach. He fired his physios who went to Team Yannick Sinner. He fired his longtime agent and PR person who were a couple who were with him forever and ever. He basically just threw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think part of it is he's trying to keep things sparky, keep things fresh, give himself
I have a theory.
Yeah, so what's fresher than this, really?
My theory is that I think he's looking for a PR play. He's trying to improve his image. His tennis is only going to get to be, he's peaked. He's going to salvage whatever he can from a skill set. And I think working with another player who's at the twilight of their career might be a smart way to do that. But I also feel like it's taking the Andy Murray lesson of how to be a gentleman and improve your overall image to the public, because let's be honest, not everybody likes that guy.
Including you, sounds like, because that take is, I've heard that before, and typically it seems to have come from people who don't like him.
It is no secret that on this show I have a very strong dislike for Joker, but it's not without strong criticism that's based in fact. And I would say that my personal sort of perception of Djokovic is that he is an undisputed the best player that's ever played the game. And a lot of people have said that. But he doesn't get the adulation that even McEnroe gets, or that Federer will get till the day he dies, that Rafa's been getting as he's going into retirement. You know, Djokovic doesn't get that level of adulation. He does from his MAGA-like fans, but not from like the general tennis public. And I think that really bothers him. And I think turning to someone like Andy Murray, who's been knighted, who, whether or not he's a good guy in the locker room is beside the point. The public thinks of him as a saint in the tennis world. So
they do now. They didn't when he was younger.
But that's my point. You know, he improved his image, and maybe that's what Djokovic sees and knows, and maybe that's what he's buying into. That's just my theory.
I don't buy that one, but I've heard it a fair amount, and I feel as though people feel a certain kind of way about Djokovic, right? He's certainly polarizing to an extent where his fan base, who are challenging, feel a certain kind of way. And then a lot of people who really just don't like him. He's a complicated guy, you guys. I mean, complicated, by that I mean complex. He's a terrific person. He's arrogant and insecure at the same time. He's a bit of a thinker. He's a bit of a searcher. He's a bit of a bullshitter. He's a lot of things, but he's by far the most interesting character to me, just in terms of the meat of everything that he's sort of gone through in his career of all the guys. And I feel as though it does him a disservice to think that one of his motivations for doing this is a PR thing. You know why? Because in the US, there's this general kind of feeling about Djokovic, but there are places where the guy is absolutely beloved. And I'm not even talking about the Noel fam. For example, when he played the Olympics in Rio, I was down there for that, and he played Del Potro. It was absolutely just terrible drawn, a heartbreaking sort of thing. And Del Potro walks on the court, and even though he's an Argentine, the Brazilians and the Argentine are kind of at odds, he got a very nice reception. And then Djokovic comes on the court, and it's like he's Jesus. I'm telling you. And I don't think he expected it. And I certainly didn't expect the Brazilians to be huge Djokovic fans, but they went insane for him, which is why he was so devastated after he lost. I mean, it's like that for him in Italy. It's like that for him in a lot of places. But ultimately, I think he's smart enough to have come to terms with the fact that, you know, when you have roommates and there's three of you sharing an apartment, it's always 2 against 1. Very rarely will the three sort of be going together. It always ends up being 2 against 1, 1 against 2. And he came along right after Federer and Nadal created this lovely rivalry. And I think he's come to terms now with the fact that that's not ever going to happen for him. But you know what? He's going to end up being the greatest player of all time. He's probably got $500 million in the bank. So I think he does want to be loved. I mean, don't we all? But I think he's come to terms with the reality of the situation. And I'll tell you what, I mean, even if he hasn't, I'm not sure how Andy Murray could really do much about that at this stage of his career.
My only follow-up to that would be, did you see the 60 Minutes piece that they did on Djokovic?
Yeah. Do I remember it really well? No, but I remember it sort of, yeah.
I found the way that he presented himself in that piece to be demonstrably different from pieces that I've seen from 2 years ago, 5 years ago, definitely during the pandemic when he was causing all kinds of problems.
Doing some things, yeah.
Right or wrong, I think as an athlete, that's a different conversation to a certain extent. In hindsight, what we know now, or at least what people talk about now.
I think it's a brilliant move. And from episode 1, I made it very clear that I'm not a Djokovic fan, but I have always admired him. I mean, I just go back to the fact that he grew up with planes dropping bombs all around him. And that had to have been, talk about a cauldron to form your mental strength or game in. And that was the topic of the word time, the main topic, right? The main takeaway was how mentally tough he is. And I think,
I don't see it as a negative. I think hiring Murray's a brilliant chess move.
yeah. I think he's going to make him hungrier. He's going to want to play for Andy. He looks up to him. He has no peers right now, so he needs something to motivate him.
Both of this guy, yeah.
That's what I'm saying. He's been looking for ways to spark it. Because here's the thing. He's obviously at the end. He's got maybe one more thing that he would like to do. The problem is that to 22-year-old studs to sort of put popsicle stick in the spokes of his bike. But the other thing is, he's not the player he was 5 years ago. He is physically held up a lot better than Nadal did. But the other thing is, he hasn't played much. And when you start talking best of 5 sets, you start talking all of that stuff, his tennis might not be good enough. Like, he needs to play more and have more match play if he wants to maybe try to pick off that final Grand Slam, which obviously Australia would probably be the place to do it. So I feel as though after 20 years, yeah, he's looking for sparks. He's looking for motivation. And even if he was thinking about slacking, Andy Murray will not let him. And again, it's a 2-month commitment, basically, off season, go down to Australia and see how it goes. I don't necessarily see it lasting full-time basis really much longer than that, because Murray's got a family and he's got things. But I'll tell you what, if it could end up with Djokovic winning the Australian Open and dropping number 25 on everybody. Everybody's going to think he's a genius. I think it's great for both of them. I think it's great for tennis too.
I think his best chances to get 25 are Australia, just because he's so familiar and had so much success there, fans behind him. And then Wimbledon, of course. I mean, he got to Wimbledon to get to the finals last year on one leg, which is amazing. And
So he says.
well, that's true. I think he was really hurt. I'm not sure how hurt, but
That was his rope-a-dope. Come on.
no, I don't. You could tell between Wimbledon and the Olympics, he got a lot better. Well, it's going to be fun to watch for sure. I think it's a huge shot in the arm for tennis, and stealing headlines from other sports is also part of the game. So we'll have to watch and see what happens.
I'm hoping that they're going to show up in Brisbane to prep the Australian Open because I'm going to be there. So
Oh, you are?
yeah, so last year Osaka came back there and Nadal was there and played. And so yeah, I'm hoping that something like that's going to happen.
So you must be pretty excited about Nick Kyrgios returning in Brisbane.
Why not? The more the merrier, you know? I mean, I'll believe it when I see it,
Yeah.
when I see him take the court.
He's like Oasis getting back together. Like, yeah, sure.
Whoa, there's a comparison.
Yeah, that's actually pretty apt for comparison. So speaking of Kyrgios, one thing that we talk about a lot, and really the genesis of our podcast, is that we were just tired of listening to what the people at Tennis Channel were putting out for commentary, and a lot of the coverage of the sport felt really buttoned up. And it was refreshing to see and hear someone like Kyrgios bring a totally different edge and attitude with a lot of knowledge, right? The guy's
You almost want him to stay off court.
right. We were wondering what's the motivation to go back and play and work hard like Andy Murray did when he can effortlessly show up in his hoodie and just spit into the mic and seemingly do pretty well. But what are your thoughts, I guess, just on tennis media in general, Stephanie, and the rise of what I would call like the citizen journalists? You have people like Pavi G on Twitter who commands a pretty strong presence, like him or not. What do you think about where tennis media coverage is now and where it might go?
I find that citizen journalist is sort of a contradiction in terms.
True. An oxymoron.
Yeah, kind of, because ultimately, and the Yannick Sinner doping cases brought this to the fore,
Oh,
where
yeah.
you have so many dudes, and they're almost always dudes, who've shown up out of nowhere, and all of a sudden they're doping experts, right? And the difference is, I think, actual journalists, I mean, their only source of information is the internet. And so the difference is, let's say with somebody like me, and it's not to toot my own horn or anything, but I have sources and people that I can talk to at the doping agencies. If I need some information or I need some clarification about something, I can get it.
Right.
And not all of it is on the record. And so ultimately, the stuff that shows up on Instagram and Twitter is basically 5% of what goes on in tennis. I mean, the stuff that never makes it there is just off the charts. And so that's a bit of a thing. I mean, as far as Kyrgios goes, he was on down in Australia a couple of times before this ever happened. And he was one of those guys, and Leighton Hewitt was another, and Jim Courier was another back in the day, that the minute he stepped into the broadcast booth, he was good. And people always said, and you know, I agreed, that his tennis IQ was very underrated just because of the game style that he has. And so it proved to be that he showed right from the get-go when he got on TV that he understands the sport. And obviously he's current with all the players, and he has moments where especially he should stay off Twitter, where he just kind of shoots himself in the foot a little bit. But generally, I think that he's been very good. And Chris Eubanks also has been very, 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 very good, which doesn't surprise me because just from interviewing him after matches and the way he can analyze his own matches, if you can analyze your own matches, you can analyze other people's, right? So, but generally speaking, tennis media is it's tough, and there's no, you know, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, and who am I to judge anybody? But the first year that I went down to Australia to cover the tournament was 2008, I think. And there were probably at least 20, 25 American journalists from Morning News and the Washington Post and the LA Times and whatever. There was just a lot of coverage from actual journalists. And so I'm trying to remember how many of us North Americans were down there last year, and maybe it was 3. And that was including Ben Rothenberg, who was basically there to sell his book.
Right.
So there was basically almost Nobody. And so that space gets filled up with the TV people, and who are basically, their main job is to promote the sport. They're not going to be critical of the players. They're not going to be critical of the sport. That's not their function. You know, people talk about tennis media as if it's some monolithic thing where everybody does the same thing. I mean, everybody has a different job. And so then you add to that the fact that a lot of people are freelancers. When you want to fill up the room, because if you're a media relations person in tennis, you don't want an empty press room, then you just end up with some, podcast dudes, or, and no offense to podcast dudes, but
Hey, now.
or guys with Twitter accounts or
Right.
YouTube channels who have sort of small followings and who also pay their own way there. So they're basically just sort of going there on vacay so that they can sort of sit in the press room. I don't go to press conferences anymore, very, very rarely, and basically just want that eye contact with the players and go, no, but just how great are you, Novak? There's a lot of that. And the diminishing access where you can't even get 5 minutes with a player now, even when you go through the agents and the this and the that. And so everything is basically the same. It's not as though, in Australia in particular, because I'm sort of dealing with them right now, it's people aren't going halfway across the world just to do some match report and get a couple of trite quotes from the press conference. That's not worth all the money that it costs to go down there. So to me, it's an incredible sport that has incredible characters, and it deserves better than what it has, which is a whole lot of not much. And particularly on the women's side, they truly don't seem to understand the financial situation that their tour has been in. I think they take it for granted a little bit. And they don't have to be Billie Jean King, basically just starting the whole thing from nothing and promoting the heck out of it and just making it happen. But they could all, and their agents could all do more to understand that they can't take this for granted. They barely made it through the pandemic and the post-pandemic, and yet the access is not any better. And it's really, really difficult. And again, there's so many great stories that I would love to write. Right now, I can think of 10 off the top of my head that I would love to write, but that I can't do without talking to the players. So it's frustrating.
Right.
One of the best comps of a sport that's gotten it right is Formula One and what they've done with their Netflix series. And we thought, brilliant move, port it to tennis, and you get the behind the scenes stuff, the drama between Berrettini and his girlfriend, right? I thought that made for great television, but obviously the public didn't. What is Formula One doing that tennis was not able to do with its show on Netflix? So clearly Netflix is trying very hard, right, to promote their ability to do live events. How did they miss the mark so much?
Well, I think part of it is that the Formula One show just captured a zeitgeist at some point. It's all male, that's one thing. And the other thing is that they sort of had a plan for who they were going to showcase, and they were going to find the hotter race car drivers, which is fine because that sort of gets the other half of the demographic. And it just sort of worked. The problem with tennis was twofold. The first thing was that they didn't pay the players to do this, right? Mm-hmm. They basically promised them that they would get all this great exposure from this show that would be worth more than money, which didn't necessarily happen. The second thing was that they didn't get the big guns. I think that they didn't get Djokovic, and they didn't really get Alcaraz and Nadal, the people that might have really been able to drive it a little bit, because as much as the Aya Tomljanovic, Matteo Berrettini relationship, to those of us in this little tennis bubble, was great, it doesn't really make a huge dent outside the little silo. Very, very niche. And then the worst part was they did this stuff in their messy hotel room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next episode checks in and they're at Indian Wells. In between, they've broken up and they don't even mention it.
Yeah.
You know, like it's not even a thing. So that was part of it. And the other thing is that the media commitments by the players are really kind of eyedropper. They spend a few minutes in the press and then they go and do some of the TV stuff where they have the same three banal, boring, rote questions from 3 or 4 different rights holders or whatever. They're not at ease with that kind of blanket attention. I mean, you even remember Federer got annoyed because they put all these cameras down in the tunnel of the Australian Open where they were catching people doing this, that, and the other thing. And he got really, really pissed about that because he felt like the only place he could really hide and not have cameras around was in the men's room. And that was probably true. But yeah, they're not used to that. So they're not comfortable with having cameras follow them around because they're not used to it. So I think that that was part of it as well. And the other thing is, I'm not sure they really asked anybody what the great storylines were in these particular years, because I could have given them 5 or 10 that were way better than the ones that they ended up going with. So I think it was a great idea. I just think that the people who were putting this together really didn't understand tennis all that well, if that makes sense.
I think they had better access with those players. I think you're absolutely right. I think the narratives and the storylines could have been much better, but it might have been more difficult to produce, or they might not have had the same level of access.
Yeah, it was very, very tough. The agents get involved. And again, they weren't paying them. It's weird when you would see them shooting. You look at them, and to you, as you're watching it as a viewer, it looks like a shot of Stefanos Tsitsipas walking across the campus at Melbourne Park. But what's actually happening, because I watched them film a lot of this stuff, right? It's actually Stefanos Tsitsipas walking and 5 people or more who are basically walking backwards, shooting him while he's walking. So that's not even a situation where you can even be yourself or even be natural or whatever. So, and again, they're not used to any of that. And I said, it's really a shame because there's certainly a lot of personalities on the tours that are not known, and they didn't take advantage of that. They got who agreed to do it ultimately.
It's going to be interesting to see what Netflix does next, Stephanie, as someone who covered the Expos, and I'm sure has an affinity for the Habs in Montreal.
No, as a Bruins fan.
Oh, nice.
There are a lot of us in Montreal. It becomes a thing.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what Netflix does next. I'm sure you saw or heard of the Tyson-Jake Paul fight that supposedly...
I watched it, yeah.
108 million viewers here. There's going to be a lot more of that to come. And I think the Formula One series just set the bar so high. It's probably one of the best produced series I've ever seen. And my better half has never watched a race in her entire life. I've probably been to about 100 NASCAR races, which she says, how's that racing? They just turn left for 3 hours. It's the biggest redneck thing I've ever seen. She watched one episode of the Formula One series and followed every single racer, Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, all of them, tracks what they wear on their way to and from the races. She watches the pre-race pit interviews. She's just an absolute fanatic.
It brought in a huge audience of women.
Yeah.
As you said, some of the drivers are kind of hot guys. They're a little short in person, but they have to fit into those race cars. But tennis has hot guys too. Tennis has a ton of hot guys. But yeah, for whatever reason, it was the right thing at the right time. And the problem with any other series that happens after that is that it's only going to suffer by comparison. It just hit for whatever reason. It's really unfortunate. People would always ask me what I thought about Breakpoint. And I said, you know what? I'm not the right person to ask because I'm not their demographic. I'm not their target market. It's really for people who don't know much about it and want to get introduced to it. And as I said, I could think of 10 stories off the top of my head, storylines that would have been better. And most people who cover the sport on a regular basis probably could as well.
To your point, we're interested to see what they do next. Down here, south of your border, they're going to be doing the 2 Christmas Day games in Pittsburgh and in Houston at 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock on Christmas Day. It'll be interesting to see what they do after that.
And hopefully they'll get the buffering situation and everything that went on with the Tyson
nightmare
fight. The last time I saw Mike Tyson, because he's pretty big into tennis, one of his girls plays. And the last time I saw him was in Miami in March, and I was doing TV and I was on the side of the court, and all of a sudden I got this massive whiff of stinkweed, like the bad stuff, the really stinky stuff. And it's funny, and I turned around and there's Mike Tyson literally sitting in the front row right behind me. It wasn't him, but he is in that business, so I thought that was pretty funny.
He has gummies that are shaped like Evander Holyfield's ear with a piece of it bitten out. They did an ad together. He gives him his ear back, and it's a gummy.
These dudes lost a lot of money through a lot of bad decisions in their lives. So it's all scrambled now. So the 20 large that he got for that evening with Jake Paul will go a long way towards helping him there.
That was the most scripted fight I think I've ever seen. It was barely a fight.
Stephanie, I'll give you the choice here of answering one of 2 questions. One, we can talk about the Australian Open and kind of what you're looking forward to down under, or I'm still intrigued to know what the 10 stories are that you might write about that nobody's covering.
I can't really, because again, some of these things are pretty good, but I can't write them without talking to the players who are involved with them, right? Because that wouldn't be right. I could drop a whole bunch of
Yeah.
juice or stuff on you, but that's not how I roll. I'm not dude on Twitter.
Like from a hypothetical point of view, what kind of stories?
Oh, well, the thing is, most of them are not great stories, right? Not happy stories. So again, if I open that can of worms, then off we go. And so the reason why, even though I have a lot of information about why I don't write them, is because it's just not right to do it without talking to the people involved. But to do that, you need access. You need to be able to sit
Right.
down for somebody, not to have some handler hanging over you going, okay, you got 3 minutes. To give you just a quick example, I wrote a piece for the US Open program. And the whole idea was it was going to be the Coco show. So they wanted a piece on Sabalenka and Rybakina, who were right up there, and they called it Fire and Ice, which I thought was great. They were very similar types of players and really great players. And they also were fairly friendly with each other. This is a thing that gets looked at by 700,000 people. It's going to be a nice, happy, puff piece. And these women are going to get attention at the biggest Grand Slam of the year, right? Just to try to get a couple of minutes. I mean, it could have been easy, right? And I started this 2 months before I did it at Roland Garros. I started 2 months before with the agents, and I went to the WTA, and the WTA were like, "Oh, I don't think they'd be interested in that." I'm like, "Well, thanks for your support." So I went straight to the agents, and I tried to arrange it, and I got this, and yeah, and sure, and we'll talk about it. We're talking. I could have gone. They practiced together the Thursday before the tournament. I could have gone down to the court, interviewed them together, gotten some really cute stuff about each other. It would have literally taken 7 minutes, and it would have been a great story. I couldn't make this happen.
They're just overly programmed and they're protected by their handlers.
Part of it is the ages. And so with Rebecca, it was just an absolute dog's breakfast of a thing. And oh, she's got so much to do this week. She doesn't have time, all this kind of. And in the end, I was able to get a little bit of time with Sabalenka, who's great. She'll just ramble about anything. And so I was able to make it not terrible. But I basically told these guys, I said, I'm going to write this thing anyways.
Right.
I have to write 1,200 words or whatever for the US Open program, with or without them, whether you give me 2 minutes of their time or you blow me off. What do you want me to do? Write about their love lives? Like, how hard is this?
But that would be an interesting story for me, like Sabalenka post her boyfriend's tragedy. You know, how's she dealing with that? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, she has talked about it some. But again, there used to be more writers who would write about tennis. And the really good journalists, the really good writers. I mean, well, I'm thinking of Scott Price from Sports Illustrated, and I was looking at some old stuff recently. It just sort of popped up on Twitter. And I remember when he was around, and it's like, no, but Sports Illustrated gets access. And he's a good writer. He knew what to do with it. Bonnie Ford from ESPN, he wrote some incredible stuff. Those guys aren't writing about, and women are not writing about tennis anymore. And even if they are, again, it's just so hard when you've got somebody there just basically looking at their watch. So again, hopefully I'll get to write some of these stories someday. I'm going to keep trying, but that's how it is.
That really is true, because when you have people like Bud Collins, he'd not only be on TV, he would be writing articles and being published in God knows how many different. He'd be featured at Wimbledon because he'd wear crazy clothes.
And he played, right? He played a lot of tennis. He was well known down in Boston.
But John McEnroe's not writing articles about tennis, and he'll play a tournament and he'll betray himself and show up on a pickleball court.
Yeah, McEnroe, I have to say, I'm always amazed at the mystique, but we see things such a different way. Like, I mean, he doesn't really show up for production meetings too much, and he just kind of shows up and they pay him to be McEnroe. And the thing is, we look at it and I'm like, oh, dude, do you even watch these guys play the rest of the year? But I'm not the right market, because I have tennis playing friends all over the world. And a lot of them are like, oh, I love McEnroe. I love him. He's great. He's great. So sometimes you have to sort of get out of your own way and realize that what we think inside the silo and what actually happens out there in the real world are very, very different things. And we see that so often because when you look at the reception for Alexander Zverev with some of the issues that have gone on with him over the last few years, or even for Sinner or whatever, 95% of the people who actually show up at tournaments and aren't Twitter tennis fans, they're pretty casual. They would rather watch Djokovic or Federer or Nadal practice than two amazing top 25 guys are facing off in the first round and then they're having an absolute dogfight, incredible tennis match. But they would rather watch Djokovic beat up on some guy so they can go home and say, oh, I saw the best player in the world. The Zverev stuff is not on their radar. Even the Sinner stuff, probably not really on their radar that much. They just want to go and enjoy the tennis. So it's our little information silo, our little tiny ecosystem. And then there's really the rest of tennis writ large, which doesn't care about the same things as we do.
To your McEnroe comment about him just showing up and throwing up, that's when Kyrgios won me over. I think it was Wimbledon last summer. And Kyrgios was down in that little courtside bunker, sort of a color analyst. And he was rolling off every name of every coach of every player and what these coaches were saying and doing in practice, and half of which McEnroe didn't even know who the players' coaches even were. And Kyrgios just knocked it out of the park. I think I actually would watch any match that Kyrgios called just to hear his play-by-play call.
Yeah, he's very, very good. And I mean, I can tell you this because when I'm at tournaments, I'm out on the practice courts and around match courts all day long. I'm not inside. I'm not at the press conferences. I'm not going from my desk to the press conference and my desk to the press conference. And I'm watching people practice and I'm talking to coaches and I'm talking to agents. I'm talking to who everybody's around to try to get stuff on. And I'm telling you, every once in a while, I'll see Brad Gilbert and Chris Fowler show up maybe to watch a practice here and there. But it's very, 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 very rare that I will see the TV folks of any country, not just the American guys. I don't want to pick on them, out there in the weeds. It's a different job than mine, and it takes me a lot longer to do mine because I do spend all that time out there and I take photos and I do all this stuff. And then it's later on that I'm writing. So that's my bad for being a maniac about it. But I don't see them doing it, and I get annoyed because I do TV now. I get annoyed when they don't pronounce the names correctly because either they didn't research it or the Americans, the Aussies, and the Brits are really bad at the names. But when you say it 200 times during a match, you have one job. You got to get it right.
Got to get it right. You've distinguished yourself and described well the difference between a tennis journalist or a journalist and a talking head, right? It's disappointing to hear that they're not out there doing the homework. They're relying on probably a college intern or somebody to clip some articles and highlight them for them. But
to be fair, especially if we're talking about the ESPN crew here, they used to have all the Masters 1000 as well as the most of the majors. And so they did a lot more tennis even a few years ago than they do now. So ultimately now they have 3 slams, 2 weeks each. They basically do 6 weeks of tennis a year. As I said, it'd be nice if they were maniacs and they were paying attention all week long, but that's not what they're getting paid to do. And in the case of, let's say, Tennis Channel, they do so much of their work now remotely from studios in Los Angeles that they're not even on site. So to be fair to them, it's difficult. And again, there are not very many maniacs like me, and sleep is highly overrated. So I'm not judging them by that. It's a different job. But the problem now is that when you used to watch tennis on television, nobody really knew all that much. The internet wasn't really a thing yet, and you would get maybe what was in your hometown newspaper or whatever. It was a completely different landscape. Now what's happening is because of social media and because of streaming, because of everything else, the real diehards pay more attention to the tennis than the TV people do.
yeah,
And so the bar is much higher for them. Maybe not for the more casual fans, but for the ones who make the most noise, yeah, they're paying attention 24/7 practically. And I don't think any human being could pay attention as much as they can, especially because most of the time they're only paying attention to 1 or 2 players.
I thought possibly the lowest point in tennis that I've seen in quite some time is when, as Rafa is delivering his farewell address in Spanish at the Davis Cup, split screen to Los Angeles and 3 talking heads talking over him, and they didn't even bother to pay the $800 or whatever for a translator to be there in Spain translating what arguably the best players, one of the best of all time, is saying in his retirement. I thought that was so tone deaf.
Oh, I heard about that. I was watching the feed it might have been Nick Lester who was on it. And usually he's one of those guys who, when the Spanish is going on, kind of translates over it, which is also really annoying for those of us who speak Spanish. But there was no commentary at all. And the thing is, like, Tennis Channel could call me, like, I would translate it for them. And they have Nicholas Pereira. They could have had people there. So I felt a little bit bad for the commentators because they kind of got hung out to dry. They're doing what the director or the producer are telling them to do. And they really, it's a very, I don't want to say it's an American thing, but I guess they just presumed nobody would understand it. And so they just made this choice. And I mean, they certainly heard about it. And so even when you go on the Tennis Channel website, if you want to watch a match, they basically had the whole ceremony on there, without any commentary. So that was, yeah, you're right, tone deaf. And it was a mistake. But I mean, those things happen. Live TV.
Stephanie, I think we're going to promote that they need more maniacs like you, or Canucks. Canucks,
eh?
to spice up these broadcasts. So
no, they probably don't like me because every time they put out their roster every week of who's going to be on Tennis Channel that week, and I usually add up the women and the men, and it never really adds up in the correct proportion. So basically, if you could be dude and you could be on the Tennis Channel. If you're a woman and you want to be on Tennis Channel, you probably have to win a slam of some kind or a gold medal or, look like Jeannie Bouchard. So yeah, that's sort of how they roll over there. I'm way too old and I don't have a slam.
Well, there's still time. There's still time. I do think that the tide will turn here, Stephanie, and we're going to see more of you and hear more of you as we go forward. But thank you so much for joining us today. I think we could talk for hours. You're right. There's so much here, and your breadth of knowledge is fantastic. If something exciting happens in Australia, we'll have to hook up for a live plug-in and get some juice from you. So, but safe travels. When do you leave? Soon, right?
Christmas night.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you'll stay down there through the Open.
That's right. Yeah. So it's like 4.5 weeks. It's going to depend. I'm going to start in Brisbane. And if the Canadians make the playoffs for the United Cup, then I'll go to Sydney for a few days, which is what I did last year, and then go to Melbourne.
I think that's a super fun event. If they want to build on something, that would be one to start with.
It's tricky because I went there and I think for the Canadian team, let's say Felix Auger-Aliassime was sort of getting over a knee injury. So you go out there and it's Canada versus Greece. Sounds great, right? So it's Tsitsipas against Steven Diaz. And then the mixed doubles was not even Leila Fournette. It was Stacey Fung and Felix who decided he was going to play mixed doubles against Despina Papamikhail and Petros Tsitsipas. So the problem with it is that if you're not the number one guy playing singles, you're not going to see the court. And so the depth of the teams is a little bit problematic.
Yeah.
Like they don't have the formula right. Also, the problem is there aren't enough countries that have depth on both the men and women's side. So I like it as a concept, but I don't think they quite have it down yet.
We shall see what next year brings. And again, thank you so much, Stephanie, for jumping on here, especially with a few days' notice in your crazy schedule. Very grateful for that.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm trying to see if I got myself into trouble with anything I said. Probably not. Probably not. Good tame version, non-bar beer version of telling it like it is.
Well, if you ever make it back to Maine again, please let us know.
I will for sure. The problem is the summer is when I'm at my busiest. That's how I'm rolling these days.
Conversely, we've always wanted to come up to the Canadian events in midsummer. So if we do that, we will definitely give you some advance notice.
Definitely. Beer's on me.
Well, beer's on us. We'll buy like the real strong beer, that good Canadian beer.
Your sponsor had like a 5.2 beer.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, I don't think you Americanos are ready for a 5.2 beer. Like that's normal for us, right? But you guys, there's a lot of swill happening there, which is super light. So 5.2, I think you probably should come with a warning label.
Well, you got to be careful doing the deepas during a podcast, the double IPAs. It varies from podcast to podcast. So tune in next time. There'll be a different beer, probably different theme.
5.2, that's hardcore. That's Canuckian.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We go higher. Just that's for after.
What's the beer up there I love so much? Alexander
Keats. That's a maritime beer. so much excellent beer drinking that happens down in the Maritimes. It's basically like Maine.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
there you go. Makes sense. Yep.
Yes.
There you go. All right, Stephanie, thank you. And we will see you on the Twitter sphere for sure. And then when we put out the episode, I'll be sure to send you it in all forms.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe to Breaking Back on your favorite podcast platform. And be sure to follow us on X and Instagram at Breaking Back Pod.